I'm Melanie Tomlinson. I'm a Birmingham-based artist and I make narrative artworks. They're a combination of sculptural forms, three-dimensional pieces and illustrations. Ghost Horses and Guns is the title of a piece that's based on personal narrative about Birmingham and where I was brought up. In the exhibition there are 9 pieces. I've written 9 short stories to go with the pieces, all based on childhood memories and real life events. Down the road from where my mum and dad live, there's a real overgrown area. It's kind of neglected a little bit. It's actually a conservation area now. If you go a mile one way, you're in the city, and if you go a mile the other way, you're in the countryside. So it's kind of like this interesting border area between city and countryside. And this particular area has its own character. It's run down. There's lots of rubbish dumped down there. It's very beautiful. It's overflowing with wildlife. There's really interesting bird species. There's newts. You know, you can go down there. You can always see herons. If you walk down there, you always want to keep your wits about you, particularly as a woman. But at the same time, it's an area where there is evidence of crime. Crime has been committed down there. So it's got light and dark shades to it. And I find that really, really, really interesting, the fact that these areas exist. I find it really exciting and I like the mystery and strangeness of it. I'm not at all afraid of strangeness and mystery, and I'm not at all afraid of dark things either. I think it's to be confronted. So in the work, I've touched on those themes across all of the pieces. For me, doing these artworks for the exhibition has allowed me to delve back into the past and to revisit childhood events and things that happened that ran alongside these events at the same time. So the exhibition is all true stories. I don't really make work that isn't based in something that's true. For instance, I don't use fairy tales in my work at all, and I haven't really ever used fairy tales in my work. I wanted to create a set of pieces that are kind of urban folk tales based on past events and real life experiences, things that I remember from childhood. So although they might seem a bit mysterious and strange, they happened, they're true, and I wanted to create an archive of stories that are about ordinary working people. So my roots are very sort of down to earth. My family has working class roots, and I think it's important to create stories about people's lives that live in a similar way. I don't want these things to be forgotten. It's not just my story. In archives, often working class people are not well represented, or if they are, it's usually to do with being in trouble with the law, or there's mugshots, what crimes people have committed. And I wanted to create a body of stories of things I remember that are just about everyday life in a very ordinary area. And some of the stories might seem bizarre or strange, but they're all true. And why shouldn't you be able to tell these stories? I think it's important to be able to talk about everyday life. And I really value that. I think it's really important to have had that chance. I was encouraged to go to university and to study the arts. And again, with my husband, he's really encouraging and supportive of everything that I do. I'm very lucky to have that. And I think it's important to acknowledge that in this exhibition, that support and belief in me and my ideas. We're also very interested in nature, and my dad, I remember as a child, was always interested in birds and newts, and he would go down to this wild area that was slightly dodgy with buckets of water to fill up ponds that were going a bit dry because he knew newts lived there. And the whole family have a love of animals and nature, and I hope that that comes across in the work as well, actually, this care for the environment and a love of nature and creatures. It might be very subtle, but it is there. So in hard times, nature and a sense of peace in the environment has carried us all forward. I wanted the work to be like a snapshot of an area at a certain point in time. So it's a set of true stories about a certain area in the 20th century. And there is the narrative to go with the pieces, so there's written stories as well. And it might give an insight into how people thought and lived at that particular point in time. Again, ordinary people, of which there isn't much in the archives, although I think that's changing. When I say ordinary, I think it's kind of down-to-earth stories, things that would probably otherwise get missed because a lot of people wouldn't consider it important. Maybe it is important, maybe it isn't, but I think it's great to be able to tell these stories. I have the main bit of memory in each of the stories, But when I went back to visit the places, other things came to mind. So it was really great to go and tread the streets and the places where I remember things. For instance, the gully is exactly as I remember it. The turns and the twists and not knowing what was round the corner sparked other memories. So going back and physically being in the places with a bit of memory, with something, actually evolved into a much bigger story. All the stories are very true and down to earth. There's no frills added to them. I'm not trying to add things in because I think it will look good or add something. I'm just trying to remember things and be authentic. The places are very much as they were. Some of them are a bit more run down, but because these corridor areas tend to get forgotten, not all of the areas have been built on somehow. Some of them are gated up, so you can't necessarily get to them anymore, but they're as I remember them. So that's really, really interesting because change is happening at a very fast pace in life for everybody in general, but these places at the moment are very much as I remember them. There's a span of 10 years, I would say, so it's sort of about 1980 to just before the 90s. Maybe it's something to do with the transition from childhood to adulthood, perhaps. Maybe there's some letting go and moving forward, but not wanting to let go of certain things. I certainly think that as a woman, exploring some of these rundown places, you are very aware of what's around you because it's important to stay safe. I had a very free childhood. I was always out on the streets playing. I had a paper round. I'd be on my bike cycling around delivering papers. I remember the woman going missing. I think maybe there's something to do with that transition from childhood to adulthood and the complexities that that brings. I think if I had to pinpoint something, I think it would be that. It's a bit like with the Red Riding Hood tale when the girl's told not to go off the path, but maybe she does. The illustration work is really important to me because it's the start of everything, and I really enjoy the action of painting in gouache paint and the brush touching the surface of the paper and seeing that chalky finish that gouache brings. When I'm creating a painting, I know it's going to be printed onto a metal surface, so I deliberately enhance certain colours within the drawings because I know they'll work well at that saturation when it's printed onto metal. So I've always got the idea that the image will be transferred onto a metallic surface. I do have a particular style of painting. I love painting in gouache paint anyway, but I know that there has to be a certain level of vibrancy in the illustrations to work when they're actually printed onto the sheets of metal. Light colours are quite difficult to print using the processes that I use. I don't print white, for instance. Anything that would appear white will be silver colour of the metal sheet, or if I was printing onto brass, the white would remain a brass colour. So I have to think about the colours that sit next to the white. Maybe something will have a black outline, maybe it will sit next to a bright colour, which will throw the light colours forward. So all these things I've kind of learnt over the years, ever since I started printing metal. I used to use quite a lot of found objects, so there was an element of recycling in my very, very early work. But I'd say for the last 20 years, I've used purely my own printed metal. Having said that, in the exhibition, I have brought in some found objects. So in a way, I'm going back to how I used to work when I first left university. Not recycled metal, but using found objects incorporated with my freshly printed sheets. The gouache illustrations transferred onto the printed surface works really well. I also actually print onto wood, and I've printed onto plastic as well, so I could use the same process to print on other materials. I just really love metal. The metal I use is quite difficult to work with. It's a real challenge, but I quite enjoy having to tame this sheet of metal and create something quite delicate from it. I think the work is very complex, it's very layered. I hope people think the work is brave. It's certainly not trendy. I mean, I'm sure all artists say they work in a unique way, and I don't mean that in a pretentious sense at all, but I always try to do something that's very different. When audiences are presented with my work, I like them to explore it. There's definitely a narrative that I put with the work that you can read, so there is always a story that's there to go with the piece. I think that's quite important. The work has lots of layers. You can look at it and take away anything that you want from it, but there are some clues. There is a story that I provide to explain what it's about. So you might look at it and see the movable elements, and that's it. Or you might look around the border of the piece and see the story and the narrative. You might relate to it, you might see yourself in it, it might be mysterious, it might leave questions unanswered. My pieces are usually boxy, so there's layers, you can lift them up and look inside, you can walk around them. So there's lots of things that you can do with the piece as well as just look at it. I think it's getting people to think about the narrative that's behind it. I want to create beautiful objects as well. I enjoy processes, and the thing about my work that's a huge issue is the time it takes. They're really challenging to make. They take ages. Some of them can take months to make, and it's a very slow process. It starts with a gouache painting, which I have to research, and then it's the whole process of printing it onto the metal, making a paper model, making it into a three-dimensional sculpture. But I'm really interested in creating something that's interesting visually and has many layers. In the piece that's called The Funfair and the Vanishing Woman, there are several different processes. There's etching, there's my normal metalwork where I'm printing and bending it into a three-dimensional form. I've used some laser cutting, some traditional silversmithing techniques. I really like the challenge that overcomplicating something brings. It can also be a bit of a nightmare as well at times, but that's how I naturally work. I like the mystery that comes from looking at an artwork and have questions about something. So for instance, why is there a gun printed onto the front of the sculpture? Oh, it's wrapped up in brambles. Does that mean it's buried or hidden? Why is that image on a piece that's about horses galloping down a lane? You work your way around a piece and see a scrapyard or a sluice gate, overgrown fields. What does it mean? What questions does it ask? Can you relate to it? Details are really important to me, and I like the challenge of creating something that initially seems impossible. I know not everybody likes to work in that way, but for me it is a real thrill to be able to have an idea in my head and to be able to make it in a three-dimensional format.